Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled 5 Ways to Optimize Your SaaS Business in the Cloud. My name is Rihanna Collier. I'm Vice President and Managing Director of the Software and Services Division here at SIIA. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Jeff Kaplan, Managing Director at THINKstrategies, and David Fowler, Vice President of Marketing at INetU. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping reminders. This webinar is being recorded, and all participants will receive a link to the recording and the slides following the session. I do want to encourage everyone to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can do so by submitting your questions in the chat feature at the bottom left of your screen. Please don't wait until the end of the presentations or till the presentations are finished to ask questions. Go ahead and submit your questions at any time throughout the session. We want to make sure we have a chance to address all the questions throughout the hour. Finally, I just want to highlight a couple of upcoming SIA events that are coming this fall. We have 4 events in our Deciphering series taking place. These are exclusive one-day forums for executives. We look at things around improving operational efficiencies, increasing profitability, and basic overall growth strategies. I am currently looking for speakers for each of these events, so if you or a colleague would like to participate, please let me know. My email address is there on the slide, and again, you'll receive a copy of the slides, which will have my email address as well. Okay, without further ado, let's talk about why we're here today, to discuss ways to optimize your SaaS business in the cloud. As I mentioned, we do have 2 industry experts here with us today who are going to take us through some findings of a recent survey which examines the trials and tribulations of moving to the cloud. So with us, we have Jeff Kaplan, who is Managing Director of THINKstrategies. If you are not familiar with THINKstrategies, it is a strategic consulting firm which focuses on helping companies make the transition to a services model. Jeff is also founder of the Cloud Computing Showcase, which is an online directory for everything as a service. Also with us, we have David Fowler, VP of Marketing at INetU. And for those of you who don't know INetU, they provide managed cloud and hosting solutions. So, and actually for David's background a little bit more, in addition to marketing, he's held many other senior roles in the software industry. He's been a COO, he's ran product management, business development, so he brings a number of perspectives to the table today. So with that brief intro, I want to jump right in and turn it over to Jeff and David to get right to today's topic. So Jeff and Dave, on to you.
What is a
there we go. Sorry, I couldn't hear you there for a second, Jeff, and now I've got you.
Okay, thanks, Rihanna. This is Jeff Kaplan, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. And David and I are looking forward to spending time talking to you about some of the things we're seeing in the marketplace and what they mean to you as you're trying to develop your software as a service business. In fact, as Ian and I were chatting in preparation for this session, we were both making the observation that while it's no longer necessary to spell out what SaaS means and why people are thinking about subscription-based software, the requirements in this marketplace continue to, or the bar I should say, in terms of requirements, continue to be raised. What we saw was a first wave of adoption of those folks who were more than happy to take advantage of subscription services. But now we're seeing a tougher crowd, a more discerning decision-making marketplace where a lot of CXOs are asking some very serious questions about what's going on in terms of moving their applications and in essence their business operations to this thing called the cloud. And I've had the privilege of traveling around the country over the past few months and have seen this concern and the bar being raised by a variety of companies across almost every industry. And I know, Dave, you've been confronted with some of these same questions. So I'm looking forward to spending the next half hour to 40 minutes talking about the key issues that SaaS companies, ISVs in particular, have to think about as they move to the cloud and how they've got to fortify their operations to match the expectations of those customers who they're doing business with.
Certainly what we're finding as we talk to organizations that are moving into the cloud is that, as Jeff mentioned, it's a challenge to take your SaaS application or build your SaaS application and put it on an infrastructure that you don't have control over. So there are a number of issues that you want to make sure that you have looked at before you start down that path. And that, we hope, will be the issues that we answer today. But certainly, if we don't get to your question, make sure that you issue that question online, and we'll answer it at the end of the session.
Yeah, we've got this guy who's scratching his head because there are a lot of questions that we know you're probably grappling with, in addition to those that we're going to raise and try to answer for you over the next half hour or so. So why don't we do that? So why don't we move on to the very first one and talk about some of the things which many people take for granted but should not be overlooked. And that is how you map your services and your service delivery capabilities to the business and IT needs of your operations and, in truth, to your customers as well. And what's interesting here is, I know we can talk about the anecdotal experiences we've had, Dave, as we've tried to help our ISV and SaaS companies that we do business with, but we've also seen some statistics from the joint survey that we've done that plays to this point as well. The fact is that what we've got here is a fundamental challenge, but also an opportunity. And that is, as companies move towards the cloud and SaaSify their applications, they've got to be thinking about how they're going to manage that business in a scalable fashion. So talk about some of the things that you're seeing as they try to do just that, mapping both business and IT needs to make sure that they're properly aligned.
Yeah, and I think two of the things to keep in mind, and probably the best place to start, is not with the technology, not with the idea of hosting, not with even the application, but to talk about what your IT or business needs are. And if you start with the business needs, two recommendations. One, look at what you currently have or what you think your current needs are for your customers. But then secondarily, where are you taking your company? Because the biggest challenge, and one of the biggest challenges in moving to a cloud or a hosted environment, is making sure that you design for where you're going. It's kind of like the old Gretzky statement of skating to where the puck's going to be. It's designing for where you want your business to go to, and then putting in place the basics for that today and assuring that you have the scalability to take you up to that environment as you move forward.
And isn't it also true, Dave, that they have to think about how their customers are going to actually utilize that application? Is it a high transaction application? Is it a multi-user application? Is it an application that demands a lot of data be moved around? All of those the business process use cases for the application is going to play into what their own business requirements are as the ISV moving to a cloud and SaaS type of operation.
Absolutely. And towards that goal, one of the things that we point out here on the slide is you have a lot of choices. Private clouds, public clouds, they both have advantages depending on what your specific needs are. But also you have the ability to blend those needs in a hybrid environment if you pick the right partner to work with in your hosting solutions. And one good example of that is an organization that we work with. It's in the retail business, and this is an organization that does women's apparel, and they have a very successful and fast-growing business. But they were also put in a situation where, and happily, where they got endorsed by Oprah, and they were on Good Morning America. And they needed an environment that not only allowed them to run their standard business on a 12-month basis, but also had the ability to scale up quickly for when they have these kinds of events that increase their business. In this particular case, they did a year's worth of business in less than a day. And so having the ability to not have to pay for that infrastructure on every day of the year, but being able to scale up when you face that need is an important part of designing what your customers actually need out of your system.
And there are a lot of cloud companies, a lot of cloud service providers who talk about that idea of being able to ramp up and also tail off their capacity in the cloud, but they don't necessarily bring the skills and expertise to the party in the way in which they interact with the ISV and SaaS provider. And not every ISV and SaaS provider knows when to ratchet it up and how to turn it down.
Yep.
So that's another subtlety, but a very important aspect of all of this.
Yeah, and particularly true when you start to look at cost controls. Because private cloud allows you to know what your costs are on a regular basis. Public cloud gives you the flexibility to scale up and scale down, so your costs are variable. And the ability to blend that allows you to have a base level that you always know what you're going to pay, and then to scale up and pay for what you need over and above that.
Yep.
It's a nice feature.
Absolutely. So
moving on?
Yeah, we should move on to the next one and talk about what everybody's concerned about, of course, which is security, especially in those industries where compliance is a key concern, whether it's healthcare, whether it's retail, as you just mentioned, financial services. Every industry has its own definition of what those compliance constraints are, but they're all concerned about security as well, especially in today's world where we seem to hear about one hack versus another security incursion of a different sort. So talking about security, our survey had some results associated with that. What do you see from those results and what they mean in terms of the realities of today's world? We saw 70% of folks saying that they saw security as an important issue and one that's somewhat difficult for them to grapple with. That number could easily be 90 or above when you look at the escalating requirements in the marketplace. What do you see them having to do to respond to that?
Yeah, it's a tough issue for organizations because unless you have on-staff security experts that are constantly watching what's going on in the marketplace, the security environment is a moving target. And for every move that the industry makes to block specific security issues, you have people out there that are finding ways around it. So being on top of security becomes a 7x24 operation, and if you're not prepared to invest in that, then you want to look for an infrastructure partner who's going to help you with those kinds of issues. And I think what the survey identified is that most organizations find staying on top of those issues very difficult. Even if they have the expertise, it's finding the time to spend to stay on top of those issues.
Well, yeah, when it comes to security, unfortunately the bad guys are always trying to stay a step ahead of the posse, and that means you've got to have some real experts and also the right kind of tools and systems to keep track of what's going on out there in the meter and monitor, well, I shouldn't say meter so much, but monitor where there may be some risks or vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and so that's a great example. One of the things that we would recommend is as you look at organizations and what they can provide to you in terms of security, look at how much monitoring they'll do for you. Because it's one thing to put tools in place that allow you to see security issues, but it's another thing to monitor those on a daily basis and make sure that you're staying on top of what's happening. Because it's no good to have it sitting in a log file and not recognize that there's a problem. And you can get help on that from some of the organizations out there that are doing cloud and hosting environments. They'll actually help to monitor the environments and let you know if there's anything out of the ordinary. And on top of that, of course, we talk a lot about security, but there's also the compliance aspect. And we find with a lot of organizations, they think, well, if I'm secure, I'm compliant, or if I'm compliant, I'm secure. And those two, while they have a significant overlap, they're not 100%. And the things that you need to do in order to be secure and compliant, just understanding what those are, if you happen to be in a business like healthcare or retail, where you need to worry about HIPAA or PCI, or in the federal business, FedRAMP, just understanding what you need to monitor and track on a regular basis becomes important.
And again, having the skills and resources to actually execute on that and understanding from a best practices point of view how to put the right policies and procedures in place.
Yep.
That's also part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And tools. Some of the hosting environments provide tools to help you manage that so that when it becomes time for an audit, You're not throwing lots of people at trying to find where the information is, collect it, and get it to the auditors. It's something that happens naturally over the course of the year.
And speaking of audits, by the way, in today's SaaS and just general software environment, the competitive landscape, of course, has become far more intense. So any investment you're making trying to solve these security issues and trying to meet these compliance requirements is going to cost a lot of money. If you can rely on, or more importantly, if you can team with a provider who understands these issues and has already made those investments, that allows you to stay focused on your core competency and your primary reason for being.
Yeah, I think that's a key issue, and we should come back to that towards the end. The business model around picking the right hosting or cloud partner can have a significant impact on where you spend your resources as a SaaS company.
Yep. All right, so we talked about monitoring, and monitoring is more than just monitoring for security purposes. It's monitoring to make sure you're getting the performance you expect, because the truth is that the cloud isn't necessarily as reliable as we would all like it to be. In fact, I think I've told you the story before, Dave, where I've got a good friend who's at one of these very high-powered interim CIOs who gets involved in a number of international companies. And the other day he called me and just to sort of tease me, but it was based on his reality, he called me from a far-off country, and he said, "Jeff, do you realize how much the cloud sucks?" And he was really pointing out how performance can be an issue. And legacy software, although it's dependent upon a corporate environment, if that environment is relatively stable and the access is relatively straightforward, then the application is, in its own way, has a certain level of performance that people have come to expect. When you're now dealing with a broader population of users in a more diverse set of situations, being able to monitor performance across that population to ensure that everybody is satisfied with the performance levels becomes really, really important.
Yeah, and as the survey results showed, it is a challenge for most organizations. Not because they don't know what tools to use to monitor these environments. Most organizations have been using tools as they built their applications, and for years have been monitoring the environments. But in a cloud or a hosted environment, you may or may not own the entire stack top to bottom. And so you're sharing pieces of it. Could be the network, could be the compute processing, could be the storage environment. And depending on what you're sharing and how much cloud there is in your environment versus, say, or public cloud versus private cloud, you may not have control over what the parameters are. So as an example, you oftentimes hear about noisy neighbors. You happen to be in the same cloud on a public cloud environment with a gaming environment, and suddenly they offer a special gaming incentive, and their demand goes up. You're going to feel some of that impact in your environment. And knowing that that's going on prevents you from getting a lot of nasty calls from customers, because at least you're on the front end of the process and you can figure out what to do about it. But much like the security, monitoring, whether it's for capacity or performance, is something that you can't just turn on and leave. You actually have to monitor it, and the monitoring is not the technology. The monitoring is looking at the data on a regular basis and determining what's going on.
Yeah, having the right skills, basically, to be able to decipher what that data means and to be able to act on it, whether it's to ensure that today's performance is where it should be, or from a capacity planning point of view, being able to use that information to figure out what sort of investments you need to make in the future to enable your organization to scale to keep pace with customer expectations and demands, right?
Yeah, and I think the number one thing to take away from this on the monitoring side is you want to find a partner that monitors their environment in conjunction with your application as a SaaS company, because at the end of the day, it's the end-to-end performance. It's not the performance of the individual pieces that's important. And so it's got to be a team effort. And let's face it, in a SaaS world where your business is based around your application, hosting in cloud is a team sport. And the last thing is it needs to be proactive. So rather than having to look at all the data and analyze it, on an hour-by-hour basis, having the system be able to warn you when it sees exceptions to what normal performance is what you're looking for. And your partner in a hosting environment or a cloud environment should be able to do that with you.
But also do it in such a way that they're calibrating those thresholds based upon the nature of your business and your specific industry.
Absolutely.
It's not just a vanilla kind of algorithm we're talking about here. It varies based upon the nature of a SaaS or other kind of software business.
Yep, absolutely.
Jeff, David, before you guys leave that screen, can you go back to that slide?
Sure.
Can you explain again the color coding of the bars shown on the screen with the percentages?
Sure. So the blue are people that did find it difficult. The brown are people that found it moderately difficult, and the green are people who found it very difficult.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. We should have been better about keying it.
All right. So the next one. We actually alluded to this before. I'm a man of the cloud. I believe that the cloud is the right way for a lot of organizations to go, at least to blend it into their existing operations. But there's this misnomer that the cloud is necessarily or entirely less costly than a traditional operation. In fact, if you don't manage your cloud resources effectively, it can cost you more because it's like leaving the water running. You're letting that service be used in an efficient way. So when it comes to cloud services, being able to calculate how those capabilities are in fact going to impact your operational costs is a more complicated process than I think many organizations realize. And as a result, I've seen, and we've got some survey data here that shows as well, many companies end up being very dissatisfied that the cost was more than they expected. How can they manage to prevent that from happening?
And I think it's good to look at cost from two different perspectives. One is the cost of getting it up and running in the cloud, and then the second is the cost of ongoing operations on a daily basis. If you design right up front, and this goes back to our first item, is understanding what your business needs are and what your customers' needs are. But if you design right from the front, then the implementation side of things should go pretty smoothly. Surprisingly, from our survey, we found 50% of the organizations ended up paying more during the implementation process than they had expected to pay. And part of that was they ended up redesigning as they went. So they didn't get enough of the design done before they signed on the dotted line and then had to go back and re-engineer. So that was surprise one. Surprise two was they got 6 months into their program and they realized that their business is growing faster, or they had different kinds of business on what the design came in at, and they had to redesign their environment. And that can be expensive as well, depending on how much of an investment that you made on the front end of the process in, say, a private cloud versus a public cloud environment. And then the third is the ongoing cost associated with it. And here's where the public cloud side of things has both an advantage and a disadvantage. And those are the things that I think are important to look at. The advantage side is you scale up and down based on your business needs, and that is a clear advantage. The disadvantage side is that you have to pay attention to where the costs are coming from. And just a simple example, I was at a recent industry analyst conference, and one of the analysts had spun up an environment just for a simple test that he wanted to demonstrate to customers. That test environment only cost him $20, but it had 99 line items on it. And when you do the calculation, it's not nickel and diming, it's pennying and half pennying the environment, but it can scale up to cost a lot of money. It's kind of like leaving the water running. If you don't control the environments right, it can run up a significant cost. So getting your arms around what your cost model is, monitoring that cost model on a regular basis, and then making sure that you understand your options for maybe a private cloud, public cloud mix and into a hybrid environment will give you more control over your cost. And that's just the cost of the infrastructure. At the end of the day, there's the cost of your people too. And that people discussion, again, I want to come back to that at the end of these 5 items.
Absolutely. And the other comment you made about the hidden costs, that takes us to the next slide around disaster recovery. Because too often people believe that just because they've moved something to the cloud is going to protect that data or that application, and therefore there doesn't need to be any further backup. Unfortunately, things happen in the cloud just like they happen on Earth, so to speak, in the traditional data center. And too often, the hidden gotcha is that they didn't anticipate that there could be a disaster. Maybe a problem did occur, which would be really bad, but then they also didn't budget for the additional protection to ensure that they didn't have to worry about that down the line. Talk a little bit about that aspect of it, because it is a hidden dimension to moving to the cloud that a lot of companies don't take fully into consideration.
Yeah, when your business is really based on your SaaS application, when that is the lifeblood of your company, you need a plan for how you're going to handle a disaster scenario, because they do come up. And the disasters aren't necessarily all a function of other nature. People make mistakes, and when they do, you need a recovery mechanism. So backup is what you hear about on a regular basis. Some people say, well, I have backup, so I have a DR plan. No, backup is not DR, and DR is not, or disaster recovery is not business continuity. Each of those has a value associated with it, and each of those has an increasing cost associated with it. And so you got to figure out what investments you're willing to make to protect your business. Backup's kind of the jacks or better, and if you can't find an environment that will back up your data at a minimum, then you need to go find somewhere else to work. DR needs to be available to you, and it needs to be available to you with options that will fit your business model. And I think that gets back to, do you have the expertise internally to plan this out, or are you going to rely on your partner in order to be able to do this? So it's both having the infrastructure available to do it and having the expertise to help you through it. You can DR an environment now fairly inexpensively compared to a few years back. A few years back, you might have to pay 50 to 70% of what you paid for your base operation for a DR operation. Today, because of the cloud, you can actually DR an environment into the cloud. Even if it's a private environment, you can DR it into the cloud. And you can do it for in the area of 30% of what the base environment might be. So certainly your mileage will vary. You need to figure out what kind of disaster recovery you need. But just make sure that the services are available from the partner you pick.
Speaking of services, everything we've talked about so far adds up to a life cycle of requirements that are necessary for software companies, SaaS companies, to be thinking about as they move to the cloud. Everything from the upfront business considerations to the back-end disaster recovery aspects of things. This slide does a pretty good job of sort of bringing that all together and making that very point, that there is a life cycle of services the software company has to think about, but they also should be thinking about it in terms of those cloud providers who they do business with to be sure they've got those services to support their needs.
Yeah, and everybody's needs are different. And what you're really looking at is when you pick a cloud solution, somebody who's going to supply the infrastructure for your application, what skill sets do you have internally, and what skill sets does the cloud provider bring to you? And the two of those together should give you the skill sets that you need in order to run your business comfortably. And if you pick the right partner, they're like water. They flow to where you need the help. And so ideally, you're looking for someone who can augment your business. It's a partner, not a provider. And so from that perspective, going back to our earlier comments about the business model, every dollar you don't have to spend on the infrastructure is a dollar that you can spend on building your application. And if your application is fueling your business, that's where you want to put your dollars. And so as you look at what services that you might want to look at from the hosting provider or from the cloud provider, these four areas I think are important. First, make sure that they'll work with you on that design up front. Remember, we talked about item number one, understand your business, understand your needs. A good hosting cloud provider can help you answer the questions that will allow you to get the design right. Getting the design right leads to the second item, which is getting the onboarding correctly. If your business is dependent upon getting this up and running quickly, then you want a partner who is not going to change your design in the middle of the activities. So finding somebody that is going to hold your hand through the process, I think, is important if you choose not to do it yourself. The third area is the proactive support. And we talked about proactive on security, proactive on monitoring. How much of this do you want to do? How much of it do you want your partner to do? That's a question to ask yourself before you pick your partners, and make sure that they have the tools and the expertise to help you through that. And then lastly, someone who is not going to love you and leave you. In other words, get you up and running, turn you on, and then say, okay, fine, here you go. That's your infrastructure. But somebody who's going to come back around and say, okay, we've been watching your environment. We've been helping you with the monitoring. We've got some suggestions on what you can do differently based on what you're seeing in your business. And that goes back to the partner versus provider discussion.
Yeah, I love that, especially because we live in a very dynamic world, and the competitive landscape changes, the customer expectations are rising, and if you don't have the right kind of services provided by the right kind of partner, you're not going to win in this marketplace.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely agree. And that's a good transition to a discussion around a use case, because I always think these things come down to, can you get it right? And so AccuReg happens to be one of our customers. They were with one of the bigger named hosting and cloud providers, and they just were not getting the kind of love that they were looking for. They couldn't match what they wanted from a service perspective with what they were actually receiving. And so they came to us, and when we had a conversation with them, what we realized was they could actually redesign their environment to take advantage of some new technologies, and at the same time not only lower the cost associated with it, but actually increase the service level that they were getting. But equally important to them was they wanted to be able to make sure that they were protected in security and the HIPAA compliance area. And so we had the ability to augment the resources they had internally that were working on that, help them with the audit environments that they were facing. And as a result of that, they were able to substantially lower their costs, increase their operation, spend more of their internal resources on the development of their applications as a SaaS vendor, and a win-win all the way around.
So we've only got a couple more moments here before we're going to open it up to those questions that we promised to answer. And I know Rihanna's been collecting a couple of them. Maybe we should summarize the 5 points we've made, and then we'll open it up. So first, of course, mapping the business and IT needs, right? Number two, making sure that you understand the security and compliance requirements for your business, that target audience that you're trying to sell those services to. Number three, recognize that monitoring isn't a passive process, it's a proactive process of watching the performance levels to ensure you're getting the maximum level of service, so not only for your own purposes, but of course for the ultimate customer who's the user of your applications. also using that monitoring capability to better manage costs, making sure that you've got the right skills in your partner to help you identify where you may not be using those services effectively and getting the most economic and scalable service or predictability from those services. And the one, of course, that you can never forget is the disaster recovery piece.
Yeah, and I think the two things that I would add to that, Jeff, is the water issue, that you pick a partner that flows to where you need the skills and can augment your skills in your business. And then secondarily, probably number one importance, no surprises anywhere through the process, at the design, at the implementation, at the cost level, at the security level. The game plan is to have a partner who isn't going to surprise you in your business.
And in the SaaS business, if you have a surprise within your SaaS operations, your customers are going to have a surprise in terms of the availability and performance of their applications, and you never want that to happen.
Not a good thing.
Yeah.
Not a good thing.
All right. Hey, Rihanna, any questions come in while we were chatting here?
Yeah, we have a few. Let me start with this one. One of our attendees says there's a fact out there about premise-based software that shows 90% of the costs related to software implementation comes after the actual implementation. I think this was to your point 4 on cost. So what type of costs are we seeing after cloud implementation? I know you talked a little bit about redesign, ongoing planning. Can you expand on those a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So the cost that people run into that they sometimes ends up being a surprise is in some cases, some cloud environments, you're given a certain amount of bandwidth that you can use and a certain amount of storage for your production systems and a certain amount of storage for your backup systems. And moving data in some environments, moving data in and out of those environments actually gets charged against your networking depending on how you're configured. So the surprises tend to be when you exceed whatever you're given as your base. And for some of the cloud environments, you're not given any base at all, so you're charged from byte 1. In other cases, you're given a base level and you're charged over and above that. So understanding your usage models and how they're scaling up is really important. The other aspect is, I mentioned turning off the faucet. In a lot of organizations, they spin up environments on a temporary basis, whether it's QA or development, and you got to remember to shut those down when you're done, because leaving them on effectively keeps the meter running. And you also need to be careful to save the data, because in a lot of cases when you turn these environments off, the data goes away as well. And so protecting the data as part of that is a way of protecting yourself downstream.
Yeah, so there are direct and indirect costs in those scenarios.
That's correct. And of course, we're human.
Yeah.
And so you get all the costs of, I know for my kids, running the water when they're brushing their teeth.
We'll leave that one alone. Brianna, you got any more for us?
Yeah, so you guys have identified the 5 here that we've talked about. Are there additional ways to optimize, a SaaS business in the cloud besides what we have here?
I think these are the key ones, and they cover a pretty broad cross-section. On any one of these, you can drill down more to uncover some of the nuances associated with it. We talked briefly about DR as an example, but you can really drill down on that, and there are all aspects of what you could do with DR and business continuity that are another layer deeper. That's true, I think, on the security side of things as well.
And I'll add to it, and this runs across all 5 of the items that we identified. Too often, decision makers in the SaaS and ISV community are driven by what they perceive to be a price advantage of one service provider versus another. And as a result, they pay the price because they don't get the kind of service they were expecting, or they get too many surprises that cost them at the back end. So I think it's the key for me, the overarching message for me is you get what you pay for, and therefore you want to make sure you're not making your business decisions based upon price alone.
Yeah, and one more thing that's probably good to add is do your homework on the supplier. Talk to their customers. Find out if their customers are happy. Have they seen the results that they were looking for? Did they get what they were promised? In truth, if you're a SaaS application developer and you're betting your business on an infrastructure partner, this is like trusting your company to them. And you wouldn't just go out and pick any babysitter to watch your kids. So you shouldn't just pick any cloud company to provide your infrastructure services.
I think that's a good point, David. Okay, another question. Can you expand on the importance of an SLA agreement with your cloud partner?
Can you expand on the importance of SLA? Yeah, let me take a quick crack at that. I know you've got a lot of thoughts about it, David. First of all, an SLA is only as good as its enforcement and its documentation, so to speak. And it's not the right word, but I'm gaining it. You need to be able to have the data to be able to determine whether or not, in fact, the provider who should be a partner is delivering on their promises. But it's more than just uptime and availability or even bandwidth and throughput. A good SLA, I think, should also include response times and a protocol for how the service provider is going to respond when things aren't necessarily going right. So let me throw it over to you, David. You can embellish that and add your view on that one.
Yeah, that's a tough one. To some degree, I agree with you, Jeff, and then I think it can get too far out of line because when you start to talk about performance, because the infrastructure providers don't control the end-to-end performance in a lot of cases. They do control segments of it, and I think the SLAs should reflect what they're promising as their services.
And what they can control.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is an SLA does not make the hosting vendor do what you want. An SLA is there as a bit of an insurance policy to make sure that you're getting the types of services that were promised, and that there is some compensation if you don't. But let's face it, if you're down and your business can't run, the SLA, all the SLAs that you got aren't going to help you with that, because none of these SLAs that I've seen actually compensate you for your business impact. They compensate you for the infrastructure that you're buying, and that's it.
And too often, I think organizations will try to create the perfect SLA because they're anticipating that something's going to go wrong, and that's not the right way to enter into a business relationship.
Yeah, going back to our babysitter, I don't hire a babysitter expecting everything to go wrong. I hire a babysitter because I trust that they're going to do the right things when the unusual situations come up.
Right, and as you said a moment ago also, that's why you want to do the homework to make sure it's the right babysitter.
You got it.
Hire he or she.
You got it.
Great. Okay, hopefully I get this question right. We have another question that says, can you discuss the aspect of cloud as a business agility tool? So, for example, how you can enable your business with a software tool that the client can buy on an as-needed basis. So maybe a small internal team who needs a specific tool for a limited time period.
Yeah, so you just said it right there. That's where the agility comes from, is this idea that you can turn it on and turn it off as you need to. However, that is for one use case. That is maybe the bursting use case that you were talking about before, David, where there's a certain kind of cyclical, or maybe not even cyclical, episodic experience where you need to ratchet up your resources, and you want to do it in such a way where you don't have to make a long-term commitment. If you know how to manage that process, it can be very economical, and it can add to your agility. I think you and I, David, are talking about agility in a different sense, something that we brought up but needs to be reinforced, and that is why build an infrastructure to support your ongoing operations and build a staff to go with that infrastructure when in fact you can find a skilled and experienced and proven infrastructure service provider who can augment your core competencies. And that's a different definition, if you will, a different aspect of business agility, which I believe the cloud represents in a more strategic sense.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Jeff. There's two pieces to the agility issue. One is the agility to be able to have the infrastructure respond to your business needs. But the other agility is the agility to your business as a whole that's afforded you by not having to invest in that infrastructure. And that allows you to move resources more easily into the places that you need it. And it also means that you don't have to invest in things like, let's say, a compliance person if in fact you only really need that person on a part-time basis or on a full-time basis only when you're doing an audit. This gives you the flexibility on the business side to move your resources around on your business. On the infrastructure side, I think there's a lot of value to having an infrastructure that's agile to grow with your business. And certainly one of the worst scenarios that you see is where somebody goes out and buys a bunch of hardware, puts it in place, and long before that hardware ever reaches its end of life, it's end of life from a business perspective. And now I got to effectively repurpose it and start all over again. And when you invest in the infrastructure like that, you're taking money, cash, out of your business that could be spent on other things.
Great. Another couple questions. How often do you see difficulties with legacy application software moving to the cloud?
Well, it wasn't too long ago that was a very serious challenge, and a lot of companies thought it was impossible to make that move, and instead they felt that they had to re-architect their software before moving to a SaaS model. There are interim steps that are now available, and David's smiling a bit because his business is based on doing a lot of that. So Dave, why don't you talk about that path to success?
Yeah, so I actually have worked for companies in the past that had to go through the transition from being an on-premise software to a SaaS environment. And it's not a single-step process in most cases. It certainly wasn't for us. And for a lot of our customers, it's not a single-step process as well. If not all of their environment might be running on a premise based, at least part of it is. And so in a lot of cases what we find is there's a two-step process. First step in the process is I take what I used to run on the customer environment and I can actually allow them to host it somewhere. So same application, but now I'm not running the infrastructure, I'm not making the investment in the networks and the hardware, and to some degree on the security, depending on what the type of application is. And we have partners that are doing that. We have one partner as an example that's helping organizations right now who have invested a lot in their CRM/HR systems over time, and those customers now want to move ultimately to the cloud, but they've made such an investment in their existing application that they can't get the same functionality out of the cloud today, but they don't want to manage the infrastructure anymore, and the infrastructure needs to be upgraded. So they're taking what they're doing on their site, they're moving it to a hosted environment, they're upgrading the software, they're maintaining what they're doing, they're giving themselves more runway on that. And then ultimately they expect to move to the SaaS environment. For the SaaS companies that start out as a SaaS company, no big deal. But But for the guys that are partially SaaS, like their web piece may be SaaS multi-tenant, so to speak, but the databases are not, making this transition to a cloud-based hosted, a private cloud environment, gives them a step in the right direction for moving to SaaS. And then ultimately they can migrate their customers.
Yeah, if it's done correctly, the customers will move with them because they've made their own investments.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about the hybrid environments. You can actually create a hybrid environment where you have multi-tenant on the front end and you have, as an example, independent databases on the back end that are not multi-tenant, not shared.
Great.
Yeah, do we have time for another one?
Yeah, I think we can do one more. Why don't we get one more in here? This is a question from one of our audience members, talking about kind of how cloud is shifting the IT worker. So, are you seeing the IT workers now shifting from the day-to-day tactical stuff to more of a strategic business core role? And if so, what value are you seeing in that?
Well, I see a number of shifts going on. Obviously, there's a technical shift that is a lot of IT people need to become more knowledgeable about the cloud technologies and developments in the cloud environment so that they can do something even more important. That is, shift their responsibility from managing their own systems and software to managing that partner relationship. And relationship management is becoming a primary requirement and an increasingly important skill set for IT professionals. Dave, what would you add?
Oh yeah, so much like you said, there's multiple shifts going on. We do see people shifting from being technologists to being more business technologists. In other words, I want to know how technology can be used to impact my business, not I want to understand how the technology can be assembled to support it. And that, I think, is a more valuable asset to the organization than understanding the technology. Let's face it, when we're IT technologists, most of the rest of the people in the organization don't understand what we do. But if you're a business technologist and you can go to the management of the company and say, I can take the way that we handle our customers and make it 10%, 20%, 30% faster, or introduce new products into the marketplace faster, that is a direct business impact. You get people's attention on that. So that's one transition. The other transition is people who have traditionally done infrastructure internal to an organization are now learning how to leverage the infrastructure that is now cloud-based. And so cloud-based infrastructure is different than when you can touch the physical machines. And so understanding how to be a cloud technologist and what's that mean at an application level is if you want to stay in the technology track, is the direction to be moving on the technology side.
And let me just add one quick thing on that point. In the old world, there was a feud between the infrastructure data center operations folks and the application development folks. They lived at two ends of the hall. They never wanted to talk with each other, even though they were very dependent on one another. The whole new world that people refer to as DevOps, in many ways, has been a détente between the two opposing groups that's been driven by the availability of this new rich resource called the cloud.
Yeah, it's certainly taken the control out of the QA release engineering side. Not that it's not done anymore, but it's allowed people to be freer about spinning up environments and building apps.
Right. How's that, Rihanna?
That was great. I want to thank both Jeff and David and remind the audience, well, first thank you guys as well for all your questions, but remind the audience that, that this webinar has been recorded and we will provide you with the full recording and the slides. You see there on your screen links to access white paper and the infographic. I believe, guys, correct me if it's wrong, but this is around the survey results?
That's right.
Yes, it is.
Perfect. So you have access to those right there. I again, really encourage you to check those out. And then just finally, again, thank you to both Jeff and David.
Thank you, Rihanna.
Pleasure.
Thank you all. Have a great day.